I am Clifton Hargrove, 70 years old, and still somehow trying to make sense of the betrayal delivered by my own blood. As the man who built a commercial real estate empire from nothing, I gave them everything yet, I never surrendered my boundaries. Last month on my 70th birthday, I called my son to share a simple dinner. He told me he was buried in work. Between sips of my solitary bourbon at the city's most exclusive steakhouse, I looked across the dining room and saw him. He was laughing, raising a champagne glass with his wife and her mother. They took me for a clueless old man just marking time until the end. I walked straight over and snapped his corporate credit card in two, right there on their table. That night I logged into my secure servers, locked down my assets, and set in motion a plan that would leave them buried under $15 million in toxic federal debt. The ringing of the phone cut through my quiet, empty office. 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, not just any Tuesday, my 70th birthday. I was seated behind my heavy walnut desk at Hargrove Holdings, gazing out at the city skyline I had spent 4 decades helping to shape. I lifted the receiver and dialed my son, Brennan, 36 years old, my vice president, and the only real family I had left. The line rang 3 times before he finally answered. Beneath his voice, I caught the faint rustle of papers, a carefully staged sound from someone performing the role of a man swamped with work. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you found your way here today. Before we begin, if these stories speak to you, tap, subscribe, so the next one comes straight to you. It only takes a second. And I'd love to know, is this your first time sitting with me, or have you been here for a while? Either way, drop it in the comments in a story about loyalty and betrayal. Knowing who's in the room matters. Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been dramatized for the telling, and any resemblance to real persons or events is entirely coincidental. What endures is the message at the heart of it. Brennan, I said, keeping my voice easy. I know it's getting late, but I thought we could head down to the Capitol Grill on Michigan Avenue. Get a ribeye, maybe crack open a decent bottle of scotch. It is my 70th, after all. A long, theatrical sigh came through the receiver. The kind of sigh a sulking teenager produces when told to clean up, not what a grown man gives his father. "Dad, I am so sorry," Brennan said. His voice was thick with rehearsed exhaustion. "I am completely swamped here. The city planning office just rejected the zoning permits for the new near North Side commercial lot. I am going to be chained to my desk, buried in blueprints and legal files until midnight. There is no way I can leave right now." I leaned back in my leather chair. A hollow ache settled into my chest, the quiet particular disappointment that only a parent truly knows. But mixed in with it was a flicker of misguided pride. I had raised this empire from nothing. Back in the 1980s, I slept for 3 years in the cab of a battered flatbed truck, surviving on cold canned soup pouring concrete by day, and reading local property law by flashlight after dark. I built Hargrove Holdings, so my son would never once have to know the feeling of real hunger. If he was burning the midnight oil to protect what we had built, how could I hold that against him? "I understand, son," I said, evenly swallowing everything I felt. "The business has to come first. Keep those permits moving and don't run yourself into the ground. We'll celebrate next week. Thanks, Dad. You're the best. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Happy birthday." The line went dead. I sat in the stillness of my office for a long while. 70 years old. It is a peculiar milestone. You imagine yourself surrounded by noise, by family, by some living proof of the life you have made. What I had instead was the low hum of the air conditioning and the faraway wail of city sirens below. I decided I was not going to eat a frozen dinner on my 70th birthday. I pulled on my overcoat, rode the private elevator down to the parking garage, and got behind the wheel. Driving through the lit-up downtown streets, my mind drifted back to Brennan's childhood. I thought about the youth soccer matches I had missed because I was in a bank hammering out loan terms to keep the company alive. I thought about the guilt that gnawed at me every time a business trip pulled me away. I had overcompensated. I could see that plainly now. The brand new cars, the debt-free college education, the executive title handed to him straight out of school. I wanted to be the generous father, the man who cleared every obstacle from his son's path. I believed I was shielding him. What I had actually done was cut him off from the friction that builds a person. I had robbed him of the struggle that forges character. And what I got in return was a 36-year-old man who could lie to his father's face without flinching on his birthday. The valet took my keys with a respectful nod when I pulled up to the steakhouse. This was a place where everyone knew who I was. A place where I had sealed million-dollar deals over dry-aged steaks. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the warm, amber-lit interior. Roasted garlic-seared meat and the quiet luxury of expensive red wine filled the air. Soft piano music played over the speakers, weaving beneath the low murmur of wealthy patrons settled in for the evening. The maitre d' appeared at my side, at once a practiced, warm smile on his face. "Mr. Hargrove, a very happy birthday to you, sir. Will you be joining the rest of your party?" I stopped short, a frown crossing my face. "My party?" "Yes, sir," he said, gesturing toward the far end of the dining room. "Your son arrived roughly 30 minutes ago with his guests. We've seated them in the center VIP booth just as he requested." A chill moved through me, not the cold of the night air outside, but the sudden sharp drop in temperature that comes when your understanding of reality cracks open. I did not ask the maitre d' to lead the way. I simply gave a short nod and made my way through the dining room on my own. Each step felt a little heavier than the one before. I moved around waiters balancing silver trays and couples laughing at candlelit tables. Then, from somewhere near the center of the room, I heard a loud, booming laugh. "Brennan?" I eased behind a wide decorative pillar and looked toward the VIP booth. My son was not buried under zoning paperwork. He was not staring at a single blueprint. He was settled into a plush leather booth in a perfectly tailored suit, wearing the most relaxed expression I had seen on him in months. Right beside him sat his wife Celeste. She was leaning into his shoulder, a crystal flute of vintage champagne in her hand. And holding court across from them, commanding the full attention of the table, was Loretta Celeste's mother. Loretta was a woman who wore too much perfume and performed old money without ever having earned it. Despite never having worked a day in her life, she ate like royalty. 3 massive charcuterie and seafood spreads dominated the center of the table, loaded with imported oysters, stone crab claws, and jumbo shrimp. 2 open champagne bottles sat chilling in silver buckets alongside them. I watched Loretta pick methodically through her plate. I had never warmed to Loretta. From the day Brennan married Celeste, she had treated my wealth like a personal inheritance. The passive-aggressive comments came in a steady stream, hints that a truly generous father would buy his son a bigger home, that a good son-in-law would fund his mother-in-law's European holidays. I had always let it pass, choosing family peace over petty squabbles, but watching her laugh here, fork in hand, mouth full, made the blood rise in me. Celeste, too, was showing me something new. In my presence, she played the composed, respectful daughter-in-law. Now leaning against Brennan, her eyes were sharp and calculating, holding something close to contempt. I stood in the shadow of that pillar, nailed to the floor by the sheer brazenness of the lie. My son had seen my name on his phone on the evening of my 70th birthday and chosen to fabricate an excuse so he could sit here drinking champagne with his mother-in-law. "Oh, Brennan, you spoil us terribly," I heard Loretta announce, her voice cutting right over the piano music. "This place is absolutely stunning, and on a Tuesday no less." "Only the best for my girls," Brennan replied smoothly, lifting his glass to meet theirs. "We've earned a night out. The office has been relentless lately." Celeste laughed, tilting her head back with her drink in hand. "Are you sure your father isn't going to notice you slipped out? You know how he fixates on his precious schedules." I held completely still, waiting for my son to push back, waiting for one small sign that he respected the man whose money clothed his back and kept a roof above his head. Brennan just scoffed a dismissive roll of his eyes. "Please, my dad is a clueless old man. He is so locked inside his golf swing and his retirement plans that he has absolutely no idea what goes on beyond his own office walls. He swallowed the zoning permit story whole without a moment's hesitation. He is completely out of the loop." All 3 of them erupted in laughter. It was a mocking, cruel sound that landed harder than a physical blow. I did not feel sadness in that moment. The hollow ache dissolved on the spot, replaced by a burning, razor-edge clarity. I had spent 40 years in the arena with corporate sharks, backstabbers, and hostile takeover artists. I knew how to read a predator. I simply never expected to find 3 of them feeding at a dinner table on my dime, laughing at the man who funded all of it. I did not turn around. I did not go home to lick my wounds. I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked directly toward their table. The soft piano music continued to drift through the room, but the only sound that registered was the steady, deliberate strike of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor. They were about to discover that the clueless old man they were mocking was the one who had built the cage they were sitting in. I took that first step out of the shadows. The piano playing through the speakers seemed to fall away entirely replaced by the quiet measured rhythm of my leather shoes on the polished floor. I did not hurry. A man who has navigated 40 years of commercial real estate's treacherous currents understands the power of pace. You do not run toward a confrontation. You walk toward it, deliberately owning every inch of the ground beneath your feet. As I closed the distance to the center VIP booth, the three of them remained completely unaware. Loretta was holding court, waving a silver oyster fork through the air, mid-story her diamond-ringed fingers catching the light stones that my son's paycheck had almost certainly covered. Celeste was laughing freely, head thrown back her hair, catching the warm, ambient glow. And Brennan, my own son, the boy I had hoisted on my shoulders and built a dynasty for, sat there wearing a loose, self-satisfied grin, tilting another glass of vintage champagne toward his mother-in-law. I stopped exactly 2 FT from the edge of their table. I simply stood there letting my shadow fall across the crisp white linen. Brennan was the first to see me. The smile died on his face, his eyes going wide as though something had risen up through the floor. The champagne flute in his grip tilted, sloshing a few drops of the expensive golden liquid down his cuff. He choked on his own breath. Celeste followed his gaze. Her laughter stopped so suddenly it was as if someone had cut a wire. She pressed herself back against the leather booth, eyes flicking between me and her husband in naked panic. Loretta was the last to understand that the evening was finished. She lowered her oyster fork mouth, still half open. The imperious gleam in her eyes snuffed out and replaced by a wide, startled stare. For 10 long seconds, no one said a word. The tables around us carried on their animated conversations, entirely oblivious to the silent storm that had just descended on this booth. "Dad," Brennan finally managed barely above a whisper. All the bravado he had been wearing moments before was completely gone. He swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. "What are you doing here?" "It is my 70th birthday, Brennan," I said. My voice was level, calm, and entirely without warmth. I decided to treat myself to a decent steak. Since you told me you were under a mountain of zoning paperwork back at the office, I assumed I would be dining alone. So you can understand my surprise at finding my hard-working vice president right here in the center of the dining room. The lie came out of his mouth before he could catch it. The desperate, scrambling lie of a man with no exit. "Dad, hold on. It is not what it looks like. We are here with a client. Loretta has a contact who works as a major architectural consultant. She has been helping me pitch some preliminary design ideas for the new near North Side commercial lot. I had the full portfolio ready to bring to you first thing tomorrow morning. I swear we are working." I looked at the table. There were no blueprints. There were no legal pads. There were no sketches of any kind. What there was, a towering ruin of cracked crab legs, empty lobster shells, and half-finished caviar. "Working," I repeated just barely above a murmur. Celeste moved to intervene. Her voice dialed up to an artificial sweetness as she tried to salvage what could not be salvaged. "Clifton, please, we truly did not want to pull you away on your special evening. Brennan was only trying to carry the load so you could enjoy some peace. Why don't you pull up a chair? Let us get you something to drink to celebrate." I gave her nothing. My attention had already shifted to the one piece of paper on the entire table. Resting on a small silver tray beside Loretta's plate was the itemized bill. Even from 2 FT away, the figures at the bottom were impossible to overlook. $3,500. And lying squarely on top of that receipt, catching the soft glow of the chandelier, was a heavy matte black metal card, the Hargrove Holdings corporate credit card. My chest tightened, not from grief. It was a visceral, bone-deep anger that dragged me backward through the years. I stared at that card, and I was no longer standing in a luxury restaurant. I was 32 years old again. It was a freezing November night in 1983. I was sleeping in the cab of a beaten-up Ford pickup truck parked on a muddy construction site, because paying rent and covering payroll for my 3 laborers at the same time was not possible. I remembered waking up, shaking my hands split, and bleeding from working concrete in the bitter cold. I remembered scrubbing my face in the icy water of a gas station sink before walking into bank after bank, asking loan officers to take a chance on my first commercial project. I remembered missed meals, missed sleep, and missed every ordinary comfort of living, pouring everything I had, body and soul, into the foundation of a company that would carry my name. I had weathered a decade of punishing backbreaking poverty so that the name Hargrove Holdings would mean something, so it would command respect, so my family would never have to shiver in the cold. And here was my son, using the hard-won fruit of that suffering to purchase $3,000 worth of seafood for a woman who held me in contempt while joking about what a clueless old man I had become. I reached out slowly. Neither Brennan nor Celeste dared to move a muscle. Loretta sat perfectly rigid, her breath caught in her throat. I lifted the heavy black corporate card from the silver tray. The cold weight of it sat solid in my palm. I looked Brennan directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to. The quiet authority of a man who knows exactly what he has built carries far more force than any shouting match ever could. Dad Brennan pleaded, his voice beginning to waver. Please let us step outside and talk this through. People are starting to look over here. He was not wrong. The unnatural stillness at our table had begun pulling in curious glances from the surrounding patrons. Nearby conversations had dropped to murmurs, and eyes were drifting our way. You should have been reviewing zoning permits, son, I said quietly, gripping the edges of the card with both hands. You should have been guarding the legacy I placed in your hands. I applied pressure. The thick titanium resisted for just a fraction of a second before it gave. With a sharp, clean crack, the card snapped in two. Celeste gasped. Brennan recoiled. Loretta went pale. I dropped both pieces directly onto Loretta's plate. Happy birthday to me, I said. Pick up the bill yourself, son. Then I turned and walked out, leaving them where they sat. I stepped into the cool night air, the heavy doors of the steakhouse falling shut behind me. The drive back to my estate was a smear of neon and dark road. My hands were locked around the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles physically ached, but the physical strain was nothing against the cold understanding settling deep into my bones. The jolt of adrenaline from the restaurant was already draining away, and what replaced it was a chilling, absolute clarity. I turned through the wrought iron gates of my property gravel, grinding under my tires, and came to a stop in front of the sprawling stone mansion. Every light inside was off. It was a monument to everything I had built, a fortress raised to shield my family from a world that shows no mercy. Tonight it felt hollow beyond words. I let myself in through the front door and crossed the grand foyer. My footsteps rang off the marble tiles. I left the main lights dark. I went straight to my private study and drew the heavy oak door shut behind me. I crossed to the bar cart, lifted the crystal decanter, and poured myself 2 fingers of neat scotch. I held the glass up to the pale moonlight coming through the window, but did not drink. My mind was moving fast, replaying every expression I had witnessed at that table. Brennan had not merely lied to me. He had lied with the smooth, effortless ease of a man who had done it many times over. The heat of snapping that corporate card was cooling now, and the analytical part of my mind, the part that had coldly assessed commercial real estate acquisitions for 4 decades, took full command. I settled into my wingback chair and set the scotch on the desk. This was not a matter of a missed birthday. It was not even really about the $3,500 spent on oysters and vintage champagne. Those were just symptoms. The actual disease was the staggering entitlement I had watched play out at that table. Loretta had been feasting on my money, without a flicker of shame, treating my son like her own private fund. And Celeste had mocked me. She had laughed while Brennan called me a clueless old man who was too fixated on his golf game to see what was happening inside his own company. That particular piece was the one that twisted something hard and cold in my gut. Brennan believed I had gone entirely blind. He had genuinely convinced himself that, because I had pulled back and let him run the daily operations of Hargrove Holdings, I had lost my edge. If he felt confident enough to casually swipe a high-limit corporate card for a lavish family dinner, knowing full well that accounting processed every receipt, every single Friday, it meant he no longer feared oversight. It meant he had found a way around it entirely. A man does not begin by stealing thousands in plain sight of others. He starts small. He tests the fences first. Only once he is certain the alarms have gone quiet does he grow bold enough to host a feast in the middle of the city. I looked around my study at the framed blueprints of my first commercial high-rise, at the worn orange hard hat, sitting on a shelf as a reminder of precisely where I had come from. I had spent 40 years making sure that no outside force could ever strip a single brick from what I had built. Now the thief had the keys to the front door. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat in the dark watching the shadows move slowly across the hand-woven Turkish rug, As the early morning hours crept by, I traced the pattern of my son's recent behavior. The sudden unannounced meetings with contractors. I had never vetted the times I had asked to review the quarterly expenditure reports, only for Brennan to wave me off, claiming he was still pulling the numbers together for a cleaner presentation. I had blindly extended him the benefit of the doubt. I had let a father's pride completely override the survival instincts of a chief executive. I had trained him to manage vast properties, negotiate complex leases, and oversee massive construction budgets. I had handed him immense financial authority, assuming his moral compass was as solid as the steel framing our corporate buildings. That assumption was the costliest mistake of my entire career. By the time the first light of morning pushed over the horizon, painting the sky in thin shades of orange and gray, every trace of parental grief had burned away completely. What was left was a singular unbreakable resolve. I got to my feet, joints stiff from the long night, and crossed to my desk. I picked up my phone and checked the time. It was exactly 6:00 in the morning, too early for most of the corporate world, but not for the man I needed to reach. I dialed the direct cell of Aldous Beckett. Aldous was the senior corporate attorney for Hargrove Holdings, a ruthless, razor-sharp legal mind who had stood faithfully at my side through the most brutal corporate battles of the late 90s. He picked up on the second ring voice, crisp and instantly alert. He understood that a call from me before sunrise meant something had gone seriously wrong. I did not waste a breath on pleasantries. I walked him through everything that had happened at the restaurant, the fabricated excuse, the champagne, the mockery, the severed corporate card. Aldous listened without a word. When I finished, he released a slow, measured breath. I told him I needed a complete, unvarnished accounting of my son's financial footprint inside the company. I instructed Aldous to go around the internal accounting department entirely. I wanted a forensic shadow audit run across every transaction Brennan had authorized over the last 24 months, every corporate card statement, every vendor invoice bearing his signature, every expense report he had ever filed, pulled and examined by an outside team. Aldous warned me that this kind of internal investigation could set off alarms if Brennan had accomplices inside the finance department. I told him to lock down server access under the cover of a routine security upgrade. Brennan was not to know a single thing until I had every document in my hands. Aldous agreed, his tone shifting to something deadly serious. He promised a preliminary report on my desk by noon. I put the phone down and looked out through the glass. The sprawling city below was just starting to stir, the streets filling with people heading to their daily work. They had no idea that far above them, an empire was about to be purged. I slowly poured the scotch down the heavy brass drain. I no longer needed expensive alcohol to take the edge off. I needed absolute, unwavering focus. The trap was now quietly, firmly, and permanently set. The morning sun crawled across the polished surface of my desk, throwing long, sharp shadows that matched the coldness sitting inside my chest. I had been in my office since 6 Noor, waiting for the inevitable performance. Brennan arrived at 9:15. He knocked twice, a soft, uncertain sound, before pushing the heavy oak door open. He looked the part. I had to give him that. He was in the same suit from the night before, slightly creased now, collar undone and tie hanging loose. His eyes were carefully guarded, carrying the manufactured exhaustion of a man who had supposedly spent the entire night locked in battle with local zoning boards. He walked in carrying 2 cups of black coffee and set one down in front of me. Then he sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, the flawless picture of a worn-out son doing his best. "Morning, Dad," he said, his voice weighted with a convincing fatigue. "I brought you your favorite dark roast from the cafe on the corner. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now." I looked at the coffee. It was a nice touch, exactly the kind of prop a guilty conscience reaches for when it needs to buy forgiveness. "Good morning, Brennan," I replied, holding my tone perfectly flat. I assumed the permits ran long. He dropped into one of the leather guest chairs across from my desk and let out a long, slow exhale. "Dad, I owe you an apology. I didn't spend the night fighting the city planning office. I lied to you, and I am deeply sorry for it." I leaned back, lacing my fingers together over my lap. "Go on." "It was Celeste," he said, shaking his head with an expression of crafted despair. "You know how things get when Loretta comes to town. Her mother is relentless. She pushed us to take her out somewhere nice, and she hijacked the entire evening. I told them it was your 70th birthday. I said I needed to be with you, but Loretta threw a fit. Celeste threatened to pack up the kids and check into a hotel if I didn't keep the peace. I was cornered, Dad. I panicked. I knew if I told you the truth, it would only hurt you on your special day. I didn't want you feeling second to my in-laws, so I invented the story about the permits. It was a cowardly thing to do, and I despise myself for it. It was a masterful performance. Had I not been standing in the shadows of that steakhouse, had I not heard him call me a clueless old man who was completely out of the loop, I would have swallowed every word of it. He cast himself as the tragic peacekeeper, the devoted son trapped between an unreasonable wife, an overbearing mother-in-law, and a father he only wanted to protect. He laid the blame squarely on the women in his life, framing his deception as a warped act of paternal loyalty. "And the corporate credit card?" I asked softly, letting the question sit in the air between us. Brennan's eyes dropped briefly to the floor before coming back up to meet mine. That was another mistake. Loretta had ordered half the menu before I even got to my seat. When the bill landed, it was obscene. I panicked again. I didn't have that kind of cash available in my personal account at that moment, so I put it on the company card. I fully planned to square it with accounts payable first thing this morning before anyone noticed. I swear to you, Dad, it was a momentary lapse to get through a terrible evening. I sat there studying the man I had raised. I could see the calculated remorse in the set of his shoulders, the quiet desperation in his eyes, the hope that his old trusting father would do what he had always done and sweep the whole thing under the rug. He wanted absolution. He wanted a clean slate so he could slip back into his comfortable existence. I rose from my chair, moved around my heavy walnut desk, and stood over him. He tensed, slightly unsure of what was coming. I placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder and squeezed. "Brennan," I said, threading my voice with a warmth I had to dig for. "You should have just told me. You are a grown man with a family to manage, and I know full well how Loretta can be. Marriage requires compromise. If taking them out was what it costs to keep peace in your home, I can understand that family dynamics are rarely clean or simple." The relief that moved across his face was immediate and nauseating. The tension drained out of his shoulders on the spot. He looked up at me with a grateful boyish smile, the smile of a predator who has just realized the trap hasn't closed yet. "Thank you, Dad." He exhaled visibly, settling back into the chair. "You have no idea what that means to me. I was sure you'd be furious." "I am disappointed you felt you had to lie," I said, maintaining the role of the patient, forgiving patriarch without a crack. "But we have a business to run and a legacy to protect. Don't let this happen again. Reimburse the accounting department before the end of the week, and we put this entire matter behind us. We'll celebrate my birthday properly this weekend, just the two of us. How does that sound?" "It sounds perfect, Dad. No more lies, I promise. I am going to make you proud." "I know you will, son. Now go get cleaned up. We have a board meeting to prepare for, and I need my vice president sharp." Brennan stood, buttoned his collar, and straightened his tie. His confidence was entirely restored. He walked out of my office with a fresh spring in his step, comfortably deluded into believing he had once again outmaneuvered the clueless old man. I watched the heavy oak door click shut behind him. My smile disappeared on the spot. Whatever warmth I had manufactured for his benefit dissolved instantly, leaving nothing behind but cold, precise focus. I walked back to my desk and picked up the cup of coffee he had brought me. I crossed to the nearest potted plant and poured the dark liquid straight into the soil. I would not accept a peace offering bought with my own stolen money. Exactly 45 seconds after Brennan's footsteps faded down the executive hallway, a soft chime sounded from the rear of my office. It was the private executive elevator, a direct line up from the underground parking garage that only I and a handful of trusted people had clearance to use. Aldous Beckett stepped into the room. He did not look like a man who had spent the morning at leisure. His tie was slightly off-center. His jaw was set hard, and his eyes carried the grave intensity of a general arriving for battle. Under his arm, he hauled a massive bound stack of bank statements, ledger printouts, and digital transaction logs, easily 6 in thick, a mountain of financial data assembled in record time. He moved quickly across the room and dropped the entire pile onto the center of my walnut desk. The paper hit the wood with a heavy thud. "Good morning, Clifton," Aldous said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "I brought the shadow audit you asked for." I looked down at the towering stack of documents. "That was fast, Aldous. Did the internal systems flag anything while you were pulling the data?" "No," he replied, loosening his tie. "I used the backdoor protocols we put in place last year. Brennan and the finance department have no idea these records were pulled. As far as the system is concerned, these documents were never accessed. Good, I just finished speaking with him. He handed me a story about an overbearing mother-in-law and a moment of weakness. He believes the matter is completely resolved. Let him believe that, Aldous said, drawing a chair up to the desk, because the problem is vastly larger than a single steak dinner. I spent the last 3 hours working through his corporate expenditure flow, and what I found is going to turn your stomach. This is far worse than either of us could have anticipated. I took my seat directly across from him, placed both palms flat on the desk, and braced myself. Tell me exactly what my son has been doing behind my back. Aldous opened the thickest folder. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with the cold clinical precision of a surgeon lining up an incision. He slid a stapled document across the polished walnut. It was a summary spreadsheet laying out Brennan's personal authorizations over the past 12 months. I stared at the numbers. The $3,500 dinner bill from the steakhouse, the spark that had set this entire investigation in motion, sat at the very bottom of the list. Next to the other line, items that extravagant meal looked like pocket change, a rounding error in a sea of massive withdrawals. The dinner was just a symptom of a far larger disease, Aldous said, tapping his pen against the spreadsheet. Over the last year, Brennan has authorized exactly $842,000 in independent consulting and design fees. Every one of these payments has been routed to a single external vendor, a company called Lumina Design. I picked up the spreadsheet. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. In commercial real estate, the major players, the prestigious architectural firms, the heavyweight structural engineering consultants, the elite environmental analysts. I had spent 4 decades personally cultivating relationships with the best firms in the city. Lumina Design was a ghost. It did not exist in my world. I asked Aldous to hand me the vendor file. He passed over a thick manila envelope holding the invoices and the master service agreements Brennan had signed. I opened the folder and began to read. Building an $800 million real estate empire does not happen by accident. It happens because you learn to read the fine print. In my 30s, I could not afford high-priced corporate attorneys. I spent my evenings at a cheap kitchen table, working through municipal zoning codes and construction contracts until my vision blurred. I knew what a legitimate service agreement looked like. I understood the precise ironclad language a commercial developer needed to insulate himself from liability. The documents in my hands were an insult to my intelligence. The legal language was sloppy, amateurish, and purely boilerplate. It looked like something pulled off a free legal template website by a college student. There were no specific performance metrics. There were no defined delivery dates. The scope of work was so vague, it was almost laughable, citing language like aesthetic consultation, preliminary spatial conceptualization, and ambient interior styling. In the high-stakes world of commercial development, you do not pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for ambient interior styling before a single yard of concrete has been poured. You pay for structural blueprints. You pay for load-bearing calculations. You pay for hard, verifiable deliverables. Where are the deliverables? Aldous I asked, holding my voice to a dangerous quiet as I turned through the pages. If we paid this company over $800,000 in a single year, there should be an enormous volume of schematics. Digital renderings, physical models, detailed traffic flow analyses for our new commercial lots. Where is the actual work? Aldous leaned forward, forearms resting on the desk. That is the most disturbing part, Clifton. There is no work. I got temporary access to Brennan's digital project management drives and searched for every file connected to Lumina Design. There are no blueprints. There are no computer-aided design files. There are no site survey reports. The only things that exist in their vendor profile are these deeply vague invoices, which Brennan personally approved and pushed through our accounts payable department every single month. I set the papers down. The full weight of what was in front of me settled over me in a cold, suffocating wave. My son was not simply entitled. He was not merely arrogant or lazy. He was actively and deliberately stealing from the company I had built from bare ground. He was draining capital that belonged to Hargrove. Holdings capital meant to protect the jobs of my employees and the future of everything I had built. He had engineered a pipeline to bleed my life's work dry. Have you traced where the money is going? I asked, staring at the careless signature my son had scrawled across the bottom of a fraudulent invoice. Who is actually receiving these wire transfers? Aldous exhaled heavily. I am still tracking the ultimate destination of the funds, but I can tell you right now that Lumina Design is a textbook shell company. It was incorporated in Nevada 14 months ago. There is no physical office address, only a registered agent and a post office box. No website, no other listed clients. The company was created for one sole purpose: billing Hargrove Holdings. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the silence of the office settle around me. The betrayal was so complete, it felt almost unreal. I thought back to the conversation I had just had with Brennan, the performed exhaustion, the crafted apologies, the promise to make me proud. He had looked me in the eye and sworn to be a better son, all while knowing he had bled my company for nearly $1 million. He believed he was untouchable. He had convinced himself that his position as my sole heir placed him beyond the rules that governed everyone else. I opened my eyes and looked at Aldous. He thought I would never look. He assumed that because I had handed him the vice president title and stepped away from the daily grind, the vault was sitting wide open and unguarded. Aldous nodded. He relied on your trust, Clifton. It is the most common vulnerability in family-owned enterprises. The perpetrator counts on the fact that a parent will always give their child the benefit of the doubt. They turn your love into a blindfold. He underestimated me, I said, and my voice left no room for debate. He forgot how this company was built. I did not survive the recession of 1987 by being blind to the numbers. I did not fight off the hostile takeover attempt in 2003 by letting details slip past me. Every single dollar that moves through Hargrove Holdings is a dollar I bled for, and no one, not even my own flesh and blood, is going to treat my life's work like a personal slush fund. I lifted the stack of invoices and tapped them against the walnut desk, squaring the edges. The anger inside me was no longer hot or chaotic. It had compressed into something freezing and precise, the surgical focus of a man preparing to remove a diseased limb to save the rest of the body. I want to know exactly who owns Lumina Design, Aldous. I said, my voice carrying the full weight of absolute authority. I do not care how many corporate veils they have hidden themselves behind. I want their full legal names. I want to know exactly who is actively profiting from this deception today. Give me those names, and then we begin dismantling his life piece by piece until there is absolutely nothing left for him to take from me. Aldous did not hesitate. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew a thin manila folder. He slid it across the walnut desk. The paper felt cool against my fingers, a sharp contrast to the burning heat radiating through my chest. I opened it and found myself staring at a corporate registration document out of Nevada. The name listed at the top as primary shareholder was Baxter Quill. I looked up at Aldous in complete bewilderment. The name meant nothing to me. I had spent decades knowing every significant player in commercial real estate, and Baxter Quill was not among them. Aldous had anticipated the question before I even formed it. He leaned forward, both hands pressed flat on the desk. He explained that Baxter Quill was no architect, no interior designer, no environmental consultant. He was a retired car salesman living in a modest condominium out in Rockford. And then, his voice dropping into a grimmer register, Aldous added the part that mattered most. Baxter Quill was Loretta's first cousin. The revelation settled over the room like a weight slamming down. My son was not simply paying a fraudulent vendor. He was deliberately routing hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own capital straight into his mother-in-law's family. Aldous drew out another sheet of paper, laying out the trail of the stolen funds. The money had not stayed in Nevada. The moment Hargrove Holdings paid Lumina Design for their fictitious interior styling work, the funds were immediately wired into an offshore trust account. From there, the money financed an extravagant lifestyle. Aldous read off the expenditures in a tone that was clinical, almost detached. Chartered private jets to the French Riviera, invoices for custom diamond jewelry, sports cars, and outrageous monthly spa memberships. Brennan was not some negligent vice president fumbling his administrative duties. He was a deliberate, methodical thief. He was bleeding the legacy I had built over a lifetime to bankroll the frivolous existence of his wife and her mother. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed blankly on that registration document. For one brief, unguarded moment, a deep paternal grief moved through me. I thought of Brennan as a small boy sprinting across the front lawn's soccer cleats on, desperate to earn my approval. I found myself wondering where that child had gone, how he had curdled into the greedy, entitled man sitting just down the hall. But grief was a luxury I could not afford. It was swallowed almost immediately by a wave of cold, absolute fury. I had not spent 40 years fighting off hostile takeovers, weathering market crashes, and grinding down aggressive competitors just to let my own blood hollow out my empire from within. If Brennan wanted to conduct himself like a corporate predator, I would handle him like one. I reached for the brass telephone on the corner of my walnut desk. My hand was completely steady, not a trace of hesitation. I looked over at Aldous, my jaw locked tight. I told him we were ending this right now. I wanted him to get his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation on the line. I wanted agents coming through the front doors of Hargrove Holdings within the hour. I wanted Brennan handcuffed on the executive floor, walked past every one of his colleagues, and loaded into the back of a federal cruiser. I wanted his assets frozen, his accounts seized, and a full criminal indictment drawn up before the day was out. Wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, conspiracy, he had committed all of it. He would face the maximum penalty the law permitted. I would not shield him. I would let the system crush him without mercy. Before my fingers could find the first digit on the keypad, Aldous reached across the desk and pressed his hand firmly over the receiver. I looked up at him, my eyes narrowing with a sharp defensive anger. I demanded to know what he thought he was doing. I told him to take his hand off the phone, but Aldous didn't move. His expression was utterly stoic, weighted with a dark gravity I had never once seen across all our years together. He quietly pressed the receiver back down onto the cradle, cutting the dial tone. He told me to wait. He said that calling federal authorities right now over what appeared to be corporate embezzlement would be a serious mistake. I stared at him incredulous. I asked him how reporting a theft of this scale could possibly be a mistake. Aldous reached back into his leather briefcase. He did not produce another stack of bank statements or vendor invoices. Instead, he withdrew a single manila envelope sealed with a wide strip of red tape. He set it down in front of me with deliberate care, almost as if the thing might go off. He explained that his cybersecurity team had gone deeper into Brennan's private encrypted server the night before. They had pushed through a sophisticated firewall searching for additional shell companies, but what they discovered had nothing whatsoever to do with real estate architecture or interior design. My pulse began to hammer a low, ominous beat pressing against my ribs. I picked up the envelope, broke the red seal, and drew out a single encrypted digital document printed on heavy corporate letterhead. Aldous watched me carefully, his voice falling to a quiet, hard whisper. He told me the embezzlement we had uncovered was damning, but it was essentially just the operating budget for something far larger and far darker. I unfolded the page and fixed my eyes on the bold black text. It was a wire transfer confirmation, but it was not addressed to Luminina Design nor routed to any offshore trust in the Caribbean. It was a direct wire transfer for exactly $50,000. I looked at the recipient line. It was a private medical practice located in a discreet and exclusive stretch of the Gold Coast. I read the recipient's name aloud. It belonged to a prominent, highly sought-after private neurologist. A dense, suffocating confusion began to spiral through me. I asked Aldous why my son would wire $50,000 in stolen funds to a brain specialist. Was Brennan ill? Was Celeste managing some hidden medical crisis? Aldous slowly shook his head, his eyes holding mine with a dark and unsettling certainty. He leaned across the desk, voice barely above a breath, yet it landed in that silent office like a thunderclap. He told me Brennan wasn't sick. He told me his team had been monitoring the email exchanges tied to that specific wire transfer. The $50,000 was not payment for any legitimate medical treatment. It was a substantial, untraceable bribe. Aldous set a steady finger on the neurologist's name printed on the receipt. He told me that Brennan, Celeste, and Loretta were actively paying a corrupt physician to falsify my personal health records. The air left the room. The full weight of what he was saying crashed into me all at once. The embezzlement was only the surface. They were financing a medical conspiracy aimed at dismantling my life entirely. The embezzlement was only the surface. They were financing a medical conspiracy aimed at dismantling my life entirely. The sheer magnitude of Aldous' words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I stared at the wire transfer receipt, my gaze tracing the ink that spelled out the neurologist's name. Dr. Caius Wyndham? He was not just any physician. He was a high-profile specialist serving the city's ultra-wealthy elite, a man renowned for airtight discretion and eye-watering retainer fees. I had crossed paths with him once at a charity gala, 5 years back. Polished, charismatic, with eyes that sized up every person in the room like a line item on a balance sheet. And now, my son was funneling $50,000 of stolen corporate funds directly into Wyndham's private accounts. I looked across the walnut desk at Aldous. The seasoned attorney's expression mirrored my own grim resolve. We both understood that a sum of that size secretly wired from a shell company to a physician, with not a single corresponding appointment on my calendar, was not a consultation fee. It was blood money. I pushed back from the desk and crossed to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the vast city I had spent 40 years building. Those towers of glass and steel usually stirred something deep, a sense of real accomplishment. Today, they looked like prison bars. I asked Aldous how we could actually prove what they were planning. Bank transfers were suspicious, but they were circumstantial. Brennan could easily claim the payment was for a private consultation on behalf of a friend or a private investment in the doctor's new clinic. We needed the communications. We needed proof of intent that could not be argued away. Aldous gave a slow nod. He told me that standard corporate auditing had taken us as far as it could go. To breach Brennan's heavily encrypted personal servers and intercept the communications tied to the Luminina design payments we would need to step outside conventional legal channels. We needed a shadow operator. By 3:00 that afternoon, a man introduced only as Rook arrived at my office via the private executive elevator. Rook was a former federal cybersecurity analyst who now worked exclusively in the lucrative, morally ambiguous world of corporate espionage. He came without a suit. He carried a battered black backpack and moved with an unsettling economy of motion quietness. Aldous handed him the digital logs and the IP addresses tied to Brennan's concealed server network. Rook asked no questions. He simply opened his encrypted laptop on the conference table, connected a series of intricate routing devices, and got to work. The tension in that office became almost physical. For 6 grinding hours, Aldous and I sat without speaking, watching the sun sink below the city skyline and drag long shadows across the floor. The only sound was the relentless rhythmic percussion of Rook's fingers on the keyboard. I poured myself a glass of water, my mind cycling through 1,000 agonizing possibilities. I thought about Celeste at every holiday dinner, all warmth and devoted daughter-in-law smiles performing affection, while quietly scheming my undoing. I thought about Loretta reclining in the VIP booth of some steakhouse sipping expensive champagne, bought with the very money she was using to bring me down. And I thought about Brennan, my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had watched chest swelling with pride cross the stage to collect his college diploma. How had his soul grown so completely rotten? Had the wealth I built poisoned him from the inside? Or had Loretta and Celeste simply irrigated a seed of greed that was always already lodged in his heart? At exactly 9:15 that evening, the typing stopped. Rook leaned back in his chair and pressed his palms over his tired eyes. He looked at Aldous first, then turned to me. He announced that he had successfully pushed through the secondary firewalls and broken into the encrypted email vault Brennan used to communicate with Loretta and Dr. Wyndham. He had pulled a localized cache of 53 emails and 4 attached PDF documents. Rook mirrored his laptop screen to the large presentation monitor mounted on my office wall. The digital evidence lit up the darkened room in a cold, hard white glare. Aldous and I moved closer to the screen, eyes moving across the chronological list of messages. The subject lines were disarmingly mundane, labeled as architectural consults and estate planning updates, but the actual contents were devastating. Aldous opened the earliest exchange dated 3 months prior. It had been initiated by Loretta. She was explicitly coaching Brennan on how to approach Dr. Wyndham with the financial proposition. She noted that Wyndham carried a known gambling debt and was hungry for untraceable cash. What followed was a chilling, carefully staged negotiation laid out across a string of messages. Brennan offered Wyndham $50,000 up front, routed through the Luminina Design Shell Company, with a promise of another $200,000 once the final objective was achieved. Then Rook opened the first of the encrypted PDF attachments. It was a comprehensive medical dossier. My name, my date of birth, and my personal identification numbers were stamped prominently across the top of the first page. I read the diagnostic summary with a growing ice-cold horror. The document was a flawlessly fabricated psychiatric and neurological evaluation. According to what was displayed on that screen, I had been enduring severe and progressively worsening cognitive decline for more than a year. The report cataloged fictitious episodes of acute memory loss, aggressive behavioral outbursts, and a complete inability to process complex financial concepts. Dr. Wyndham had leveraged his prestigious medical credentials to formally and legally diagnose me with aggressive early-onset Alzheimer's disease. He had falsified brain scan summaries, manufactured cognitive test scores, and signed the document under his official medical seal, legally declaring me wholly unfit to manage my own affairs, my company, or my life. The sheer malice of it pulled the air clean out of my chest. The embezzlement was nothing compared to this. They weren't simply after my money. They wanted to erase my autonomy. They wanted to strip away my very humanity and reduce me to a helpless medically condemned prisoner inside my own existence. Aldous scrolled down to the most recent message in the chain, dated just 2 days ago. It had been sent by Celeste. She was confirming final receipt of the fully executed medical documents from Dr. Wyndham. Her message was brief, frigid, and drenched in triumphant malice. She wrote to Brennan and Loretta confirming that the doctor had delivered the completed paperwork. She declared that the trap was perfectly set and that they had every reason to celebrate. The final piece locked violently into place. The realization struck me like something physical, blunt, and obliterating. I thought back to the steakhouse on my 70th birthday. I remembered the 3 massive charcuterie and seafood spreads, the imported oyster stone, crab claws, and jumbo shrimp. The laughter, the crystal flutes ringing against each other. They were not celebrating a real estate deal. They were not celebrating any design pitch. They were celebrating the successful completion of the falsified medical documents. They were toasting the fact that they had just legally purchased my psychological death warrant. While I sat alone in my office believing my son was working late to safeguard the family legacy, he was raising a glass to my impending destruction. He had smiled, drunk my champagne, and privately written me off as a clueless old man because he was certain he had just bought the power to lock me away forever. A profound, suffocating silence settled over the room. Even Rook, a man who had made his living in the darkest corridors of corporate treachery, looked visibly shaken by the cruelty laid bare on that screen. Aldous placed a steady hand on my shoulder. He asked how I wanted to proceed. He told me we had more than enough evidence to send the Federal Bureau of Investigation to their doors immediately. We could have Brennan, Celeste, Loretta, and Dr. Wyndham arrested for criminal conspiracy, medical fraud, and grand larceny before midnight. One phone call and the nightmare would be over. I stared at the fraudulent diagnosis printed with my name at the top. The pain of the betrayal was immense, and yet the tears I half expected never came. The sorrow simply burned away, leaving something colder and far more dangerous in its place. A clean, absolute resolve. I would not call the authorities. Not yet. Arresting them now would be far too merciful. It would hand them a swift resolution. They had spent months excavating a grave for me, and I was going to make certain they were the ones who tumbled into it. I looked at Aldous, my mind still straining to absorb the full dimensions of what was sitting on my walnut desk. A medical conspiracy. My own son was not merely trying to steal my wealth. He was trying to erase my existence entirely. I asked Aldous to bring up the rest of the communications. I needed to read every word they had written to one another. I needed to understand precisely how deeply this rot had burrowed into my family. Rook entered a few commands, pulling up a well-organized folder containing dozens of intercepted text messages and encrypted chat logs between Brennan, Celeste, and Loretta. They appeared in chronological order, on the large monitor assembling a chilling step-by-step portrait of my own planned destruction. Aldous stood and directed my attention to a conversation dated 3 weeks prior. It was a group exchange led by Loretta. She was the one who had identified the legal mechanism. She had unearthed a specific obscure clause buried deep within the corporate bylaws of Hargrove Holdings. It was a clause I had personally drafted 30 years ago to protect the company in the event of a sudden catastrophic health crisis. It was called the Medical Incapacity Proxy. The clause stated that if the chief executive officer received a definitive diagnosis of severe cognitive degenerative disease from a board-certified medical professional, the vice president could legally petition the board of directors for an immediate involuntary transfer of power. I read the messages in disbelief. Brennan had responded to Loretta with eager, almost electric enthusiasm. He wrote that the annual board meeting was scheduled for the following week. He spelled out that this meeting would be the ideal stage on which to execute the coup. He planned to stand before the board, perform the role of the grief-stricken devoted son, and present the falsified Alzheimer's diagnosis. He would argue that my mind was deteriorating rapidly, that I was no longer capable of running the $800 million real estate empire I had built from nothing, and that assuming control was a matter of protecting me from myself. He had even roughed out the speech he intended to deliver, complete with scripted emotional pauses and hollow declarations of paternal love. Celeste had entered the conversation next, her messages practically vibrating with unchecked greed. She laid out her plans for my office, describing how she intended to remodel the executive suite the moment I was forcibly removed. She talked about liquidating my private stock portfolio and using the proceeds to purchase a sprawling estate in Lake Geneva. She even cracked jokes about how quickly they could rebrand the company to scrub my name from the letterhead. Before I tell you what I discovered about what my own family had quietly arranged for me, not just for my company, but for my life, let me ask you this: if someone you loved and trusted turned out to be working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the truth do the work for you? They were dividing the spoils of a war they were certain they had already won. They were carving up my legacy the way vultures pick apart a dying animal, but the true horror embedded in their blueprint was not the corporate takeover. The theft of my company was agonizing, but at its core, it was a financial loss, recoverable, quantifiable. The darkest element of their conspiracy was what they intended to do with me physically once the board had stripped me of my authority. I asked Rook to open the final thread, a private exchange between Loretta and Brennan concerning my immediate living arrangements. My blood went completely cold as I read Loretta's instructions on the glowing screen. She told Brennan they could not simply force me into retirement and leave me inside my own home. She warned him that I was too well connected, too resourceful, and far too dangerous to be left unattended. If I kept access to my personal lawyers, my private bank accounts, or my outside business contacts, I could find a way to challenge the fraudulent diagnosis and mount a counterattack. I could demand a second medical opinion. I could blow the entire operation wide open. Loretta had a permanent solution to that problem. She had a close personal associate running a private high-security memory care facility tucked away in a remote exurban county 3 hours north of the city. It was a place designed specifically for wealthy patients with severe dementia. A place where the doors locked from the outside, where visitation was tightly controlled, and where contact with the outside world was heavily restricted under the guise of patient safety. Loretta wrote that once the board voted to enact the proxy, Brennan would automatically be granted full medical power of attorney over my life. He would hold the absolute legal authority to commit me to that facility against my will. He could sign the paperwork, arrange private medical transport, and have me removed from my own home in the middle of the night. They were going to lock me away and discard the key. They planned to sedate me, cut me off from the world, and leave me to decay in a sterile room, while they picked the empire I had sacrificed my entire life to build down to the bones. I read a message from Brennan confirming the arrangement. He wrote that the memory care facility was expensive, but a minor cost to guarantee I could never interfere with their lives again. He actually described me as a liability that needed to be permanently neutralized. The breathtaking ice-blooded malice of the plan left me momentarily frozen in my chair. I understood then that the dinner on my 70th birthday was not merely a celebration of a forged medical document. It was a victory dinner. They were toasting the end of my life as a free man. They were raising their glasses to my impending imprisonment. The woman I had welcomed into my family, the mother-in-law I had tolerated for years, and the son I had raised from birth were actively coordinating my complete erasure from society. Aldous watched my face, his expression somber and measured. He asked if I needed a moment. He said that this kind of psychological blow was difficult for any man to absorb. I shook my head slowly, my eyes fixed on the digital text burning on the monitor. I did not need a pause. I needed to embed every single word into my memory. I needed to know the precise depth of their betrayal, so that when the moment arrived for me to strike back, I would not feel one shred of mercy. I rose from the desk and walked back to the window. The city lights glittered below, indifferent to the monstrous treachery playing out in the room behind me. I thought about the decades I had devoted to building my reputation. I thought about the countless nights I had surrendered so that Brennan could inherit a comfortable life. I had handed him the world, and in exchange he was engineering my imprisonment. He wanted to strip away my wealth, my dignity, and my freedom, plundering my fortune while dismantling everything that bore my name. I turned slowly back to face Aldous and Rook. The cold resolve that had taken hold deep in my chest was hardening now into something unbreakable. I would let them walk straight into a trap, assembled from their own arrogance. I turned from the window and moved back to my chair. The physical sensation in my chest was strange, unfamiliar. I had expected the crushing pressure of a broken heart. I expected the gutting tears of a father grieving the irreversible loss of his only son. But my eyes were completely dry. The profound, breath-stealing nature of the betrayal had incinerated every last soft, paternal instinct I had carefully preserved across the years. In their place, an old and deeply familiar coldness moved into my veins. The same icy detachment I had drawn on during the most savage corporate wars of my early career. I closed my eyes and let my mind travel back to the early 1990s. Wall Street was an unchecked jungle of raw ambition, a brutal, merciless arena where any hint of weakness was instantly and savagely exploited. I remembered the ruthless operators who had tried to dismantle Hargrove Holdings before it had even found its footing. Men who were far smarter, far wealthier, and far more dangerously connected than Brennan could ever hope to become. They had come at me with hostile takeovers, aggressive short selling, and predatory litigation designed to grind me into nothing. I did not outlast them by playing fair. I survived by becoming the undisputed apex predator in the room. I learned to read their moves before they made them draw them into false senses of security and then dismantle their operations so completely they never recovered. For the past 15 years, I had been playing the role of the generous, soft-edged patriarch. I had sanded down my sharpest qualities in the interest of keeping family peace. Brennan had spent his entire adult life standing in the shade of the tree. I had bled to grow completely blind to the violence required to defend its roots. He mistook my generosity for weakness. He mistook my advancing age for creeping senility. If my own flesh and blood genuinely wanted to play a ruthless game of total survival, I was not going to carry myself like a wounded, helpless victim. I was going to show him precisely how a truly terrifying predator hunts. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Aldous. He was watching me with a layered mix of genuine concern and professional alertness. He reached slowly into the breast pocket of his tailored coat and produced his encrypted cellular phone. He said clearly that he intended to contact the lead investigator at the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He assured me that with the fabricated medical dossier, the fraudulent consulting invoices, and the offshore wire transfers in hand, the federal authorities would have more than sufficient probable cause to raid Brennan and Celeste's estate before dawn. He promised they would both be sitting in federal custody by breakfast. I reached across the broad surface of the polished walnut desk and laid my hand firmly over his. The leather of his phone case was warm against my palm, but my grip carried no warmth at all. I told him to put the phone away. Aldous frowned, his brow creasing with visible confusion. He reminded me that Brennan and Loretta were actively moving to execute a hostile takeover in fewer than 7 days. He argued that we had a narrow window to preempt their strike and legally secure my autonomy. He pressed hard. We needed to act immediately to protect the $800 million empire I had constructed. I lifted my hand and settled back in the chair, fingers laced together. I laid out my reasoning in slow, deliberate, measured terms. I told Aldous that if we handed this evidence to federal authorities right now, Brennan would immediately retain the most expensive defense attorneys in the country paid for with my own stolen money. He would stretch the legal proceedings out for years. At worst, he would be convicted of white-collar fraud and corporate embezzlement, perhaps 3 or 4 years in a minimum security facility, comfortable, manageable, forgotten. Celeste would simply file for divorce, extract a substantial settlement from whatever hidden assets remained, and move seamlessly on to her next wealthy target. Loretta would retreat loudly, positioning herself as an unwitting victim of her son-in-law's scheming. They would survive the scandal. A few easy years in a federal country club was nowhere near proportionate punishment for people who had deliberately plotted to steal my freedom and seal me inside a locked ward. I did not want them penalized by a slow, indifferent legal system. I wanted them systematically, thoroughly dismantled. I wanted to watch them stripped of every comfort they had taken as a birthright. I wanted them bankrupt, destitute, reduced to pleading for a mercy that would never arrive. I wanted the elite social circles they prized to close their doors permanently and never look back. I wanted their names to become shorthand for absolute humiliating ruin. To reach that precise level of total destruction, we could not simply react to their scheme. We had to actively encourage it. I glanced over at Rook, who was quietly loading his decryption equipment back into his battered black backpack. I told him I needed him on a permanent exclusive retainer, effective immediately. I instructed him to establish a continuous undetected surveillance feed across all of Brennan's personal devices, Loretta's encrypted channels, and Dr. Wyndham's private medical server. I needed to know every move they were planning before they executed it. Then I turned back to Aldous. I told him we were going to pursue an entirely different strategy. I called it the senile prey protocol. Aldous leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes sharp with grim curiosity. I walked him through the mechanics of the trap. We were going to hand Brennan precisely what he wanted. We were going to let him believe his elaborate deception was proceeding without a hitch. For the next 7 days, I would flawlessly inhabit the role of the deteriorating, confused old man he had sketched in that fraudulent medical file. I would deliberately miss scheduled appointments. I would carelessly lose track of important financial documents. I would engineer small, visible lapses in judgment during casual conversations across the executive suites. We would nourish his arrogant delusion, inflating his confidence to its absolute breaking point. We would let him walk into that annual board meeting next week, feeling like an untouchable, conquering king. We would allow him to proudly lay the fabricated Alzheimer's diagnosis before my peers. We would let him invoke the medical incapacity proxy in full view of the entire executive committee. I wanted him to commit legally and publicly to his ultimate act of treason because the higher he climbed on that fragile pedestal of lies, the more catastrophic the collapse would be when I finally knocked the foundation out from under him. I would personally guarantee that every board member, every major investor, and every person of influence in this city watched his total and irrefutable destruction with their own eyes. The following Monday morning, my performance began. I arrived at the executive suite precisely at 8 sharp, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that felt slightly too large, a deliberate choice designed to make me look diminished. My secretary, a sharp and capable woman named Marin, who had managed my calendar for 2 decades, greeted me with her usual warm smile. I stopped at her desk and stared blankly at the polished brass nameplate sitting beside her keyboard. I allowed a long, uncomfortable silence to stretch between us, narrowing my eyes as though reaching for something just out of memory's grasp. I asked if she had seen the quarterly projections from the Chicago division and called her Susan. Marin blinked, a quick flicker of confusion crossing her face before gently correcting me and handing over the file. A small slip entirely inconsequential on its own, but inside the high-pressure ecosystem of Hargrove Holdings, whispers of weakness moved faster than electricity. By noon, I was confident Brennan had been briefed on the incident. I spent the afternoon methodically chipping away at my own reputation for flawless precision. During a high-level strategy session with the regional directors, I sat at the head of the long glass table and studied the projected revenue charts. When Brennan rose to walk through his carefully arranged numbers for the upcoming fiscal quarter, I cut him off mid-sentence. I asked him to repeat the operational costs a 3rd time, performing a convincing inability to follow his logic. I pressed my fingers to my temples and muttered heavily that the figures simply weren't landing for me today. Around the table, the other directors traded brief, uneasy glances. Brennan, however, managed the interruption with a smooth, practiced grace that barely concealed its poison. He crossed to my chair, set a reassuring hand on my shoulder, and repeated the figures slowly in the measured, patronizing tone one uses with a confused child. I nodded along, playing the weary old man, grateful for his son's steady hand. The trap extended well beyond stage public displays. I needed to create conditions where Brennan felt entirely at ease operating in the shadows, secure in the belief that I was too far gone to notice anything. On Wednesday afternoon, I summoned him to my private office to review a routine vendor contract. Before he arrived, I crossed to the large steel wall, safe concealed behind the oil painting near my desk. I worked the dial, pulled the heavy door open, and left it deliberately ajar, exposing stacks of sensitive legal documents and private ledger drives. When Brennan knocked and stepped in, I was seated at my desk, absorbed in an utterly irrelevant real estate brochure. I watched his eyes snap immediately to the open safe. For a fraction of a second, a predatory gleam lit his face before he smoothed it behind a polished smile. He settled into the chair across from me, and I slid the contract toward him, apparently oblivious to the gaping security breach I had staged. Throughout the rest of the week, I conducted a meticulous symphony of manufactured confusion. I left sensitive confidential emails open on my monitor while I stepped out to get coffee, knowing Brennan would wander in and help himself. I complained to the accounting department about missing funds I had intentionally rerouted to a separate account, then returned an hour later to apologize sheepishly for the foolish oversight. I asked Brennan during casual hallway exchanges to remind me of the names of our longest-standing corporate partners. Every mistake was calculated, documented, and carefully fed into the narrative Brennan was working so hard to construct. I was supplying him with all the ammunition he needed to persuade the board that my mind was actively coming apart. Rook's continuous surveillance confirmed that the performance was landing exactly as intended. Late Thursday evening, I sat in the low light of my home study reading the intercepted messages passing between Brennan and Celeste. They were elated. Brennan sent a lengthy message cataloging my supposed decline, boasting that the pressure of the approaching board meeting was causing my underlying condition to accelerate. He wrote that he barely even needed Dr. Wyndham's fabricated dossier anymore, because I was doing a remarkable job of demonstrating my own incompetence to the entire executive team. Celeste answered with a cascade of celebratory messages, gloating that my performances were making their takeover practically effortless. They were certain my mind was buckling beneath the weight of my own legacy, leaving the throne wide open and unguarded. Their arrogance had sealed their eyes shut. By Friday, Brennan had let his guard down entirely. Emboldened by my apparent unraveling, he began authorizing even larger transfers to Luminina Design, pushing invoices through with reckless, sloppy abandon. He stopped concealing his digital trail, assuming the bewildered old man stumbling over forgotten names would never think to audit the internal routing logs. He even conducted a private call with Loretta from his office, a conversation Rook intercepted without difficulty, in which they spoke openly about the precise timeline for transferring me to the memory care facility. They laughed about how quickly my belongings could be packed, certain I would be far too disoriented to mount any real resistance. I listened to that recording while measuring out a glass of scotch. The casual cruelty in their laughter was staggering, and yet it only deepened the cold that had settled in my chest. They genuinely believed they had already won. They thought they had successfully outmaneuvered the man who built Hargrove Holdings, reduced me to a helpless piece on their board. What they had failed to grasp was the foundational rule of the corporate jungle. A true predator never shows its strength until the precise instant it strikes. My manufactured frailty was the most powerful weapon in my arsenal, a carefully constructed net woven to snare them inside their own limitless greed. As the weekend arrived, the stage for the annual board meeting was perfectly set. Directors were flying in from across the country, their expectations already shaped by the quiet rumors of my failing health that Brennan had so diligently cultivated. The falsified medical dossier was printed, signed, and positioned to be delivered as the definitive evidence of my collapse. Brennan had his anguished speech committed to memory, and Celeste was practically measuring my office for new furniture. They were marching forward blind and intoxicated by the illusion of total victory, and I was waiting quietly in the shadows, holding the hammer that would reduce their carefully constructed world to rubble. Sunday evening, I reviewed the final preparations with Aldous and Rook. Every piece of evidence was properly secured. Every legal countermeasure was firmly in position. I looked across the room at the two men I trusted, most fully aware that the morning ahead would alter my family permanently. Brennan had chosen to treat my life's work like a ruthless game. Come morning, he would discover exactly what happens when you force a master player back to the table. He would fall, and he would not get up. Monday morning came in gray and cheerless, exactly the atmosphere I needed to project. I arrived at the executive suite early to prepare the physical stage for the deception. I directed Marin to keep the velvet blinds drawn shut, leaving the office in a dim, muted shadow. I loosened my silk tie, unbuttoned my collar, and deliberately creased my suit jacket to make my frame red as diminished. I set generic white prescription bottles on the corner of my walnut desk, positioned precisely where anyone sitting in the guest chair would notice them the moment they walked in. At exactly 10, I pressed the intercom button and asked Marin to bring in the vice president. I threaded a faint waver into my voice, a subtle auditory signal of fragility. Brennan appeared less than 3 minutes later. He knocked gently and pushed the door open, wearing an expression of rehearsed concern. He had clearly worked on it. He moved into the office eyes, going directly to the prescription bottles before sweeping across my disheveled appearance. A quick involuntary flash of predatory satisfaction crossed his face before he buried it beneath a mask of devoted, dutiful affection. He approached the desk carefully, the way you'd approach something injured. He asked whether I was feeling all right, noting the room was unusually dark and that I looked exhausted. I let out a slow, heavy exhale drawn from deep in my chest. I sank further into my leather chair and pressed trembling fingers to my temples. I told him to sit down, that we needed a serious conversation about where the company and our family were headed. Brennan took a seat and leaned forward with an eagerness he couldn't quite contain. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, fully expecting to hear the crown sliding across the desk toward him. I looked at him with glassy, unfocused eyes, playing the patriarch worn down by time. I told him the weekend had been hard, that I had spent hours working through files and kept finding myself swallowed by the numbers. I confessed in a precisely calibrated tone of quiet despair that my memory was slipping at an alarming rate. I said I was making errors, losing track of details, and that the sheer weight of managing the empire had grown heavier than my mind could reliably carry. He told me it was natural that I had worked more than enough, and that he was ready to carry that weight for me. I held back and maintained the posture of a fragile, grateful old man. I told him I knew he was ready. That was exactly why I had called him in today. I opened the top drawer and removed a thick, professionally bound portfolio. I slid it across the desk toward him. I explained it was a prospectus for a promising commercial development project in the far northwestern suburbs prime real estate zoned for a high-end retail and luxury residential complex. The acquisition price was exactly $15 million, and the projected return over 5 years was substantial. The kind of deal Hargrove Holdings would ordinarily absorb without a second thought. But I told him I didn't want the company holding this asset. I wanted him to hold it. Brennan stared at the glossy cover eyes widening as the scale of what he was looking at registered. He opened the file and began moving through the executive summary, his mind visibly accelerating. I leaned forward and dropped my voice to a raspy, conspiratorial murmur. Son, my mind isn't what it used to be. There's a highly lucrative $15 million suburban commercial land deal. I want you to buy it under your own LLC. Hargrove Holdings will guarantee the capital. Consider it your early inheritance. Before I stepped down, I watched his face carefully tracking every shift as his greed ran headlong into his logic. He was a thief, but not an entirely reckless one. He asked why I wanted him to hold the property under a separate entity, rather than fold it into the existing corporate portfolio. I had the response ready before he finished the sentence. I offered a sad, defeated smile. I told him it was because my judgment was slipping. I was afraid of making a catastrophic mistake that could damage the primary company. If he controlled the asset inside his own limited liability company, it would be insulated from any fallout caused by my deteriorating state. I assured him Hargrove Holdings would serve as the full financial guarantor on the $15 million acquisition loan. He wouldn't need to put a single penny of his own money at risk. He would simply sign the purchase agreements as the owner of his new firm, use our corporate backing to secure the credit and collect the returns when the development came to market. I framed it as a father trying to shield his son's future from his own inevitable decline. The bait was gilded and completely irresistible. I could watch the calculations working behind his eyes. In his mind, he believed he was engineering the most profitable week of his entire life. Not only was he positioning himself to seize control of my $800 million empire at the board meeting, but now I was placing an independent $15 million asset directly into his hands. An unearned windfall perfectly suited to his parasitic nature, a separate vehicle he could use to funnel wealth to Celesta and Loretta, well outside the reach of our standard corporate auditors. Whatever caution might have remained in him was overwhelmed entirely. Brennan closed the portfolio, face flushed with triumphant satisfaction. He looked at me with a warm smile and thanked me with real feeling for my extraordinary generosity. He promised to manage the acquisition with complete professionalism, protect the asset, and make me proud of the man he had become. I nodded slowly and offered a weak smile, telling him to contact his attorneys right away and begin the incorporation process for his new firm. I told him to coordinate with Aldous to draft the formal financial guarantee from Hargrove Holdings, and that my signature would be on the documents before the day was out. He stood and hugged the portfolio to his chest like a trophy already earned. He moved out of the office with a light, buoyant step, entirely convinced he had successfully claimed my world. I watched the door settle shut behind him. The instant that latch clicked, the carefully maintained facade dropped completely. I sat up straight, retied my tie, and smoothed the lapels of my jacket. I reached across the desk and swept the white prescription bottles into the wastebasket. The trap was fully armed. By accepting the deal and forming the separate corporation, Brennan had legally tethered himself to a massive financial obligation. He believed my guarantee would shield him entirely, with no awareness that I was preparing to cut that exact lifeline at the most devastating possible moment. The golden carrot had been swallowed whole, and the hook was buried deep. Rook's surveillance network proved its worth immediately. Fewer than 20 minutes after Brennan left my office, the encrypted audio feeds activated on the monitor in my private study. He was already in the back of his chauffeured town car, pulling together a conference call with his wife and mother-in-law. I settled back with a glass of scotch and listened to his breathless excitement pour through the speakers. He recounted every detail of our conversation, casting himself as the sharp operator who had just pried a $15 million golden ticket from the hands of a deteriorating old fool. He described my feigned confusion with cruel relish, mocking my trembling hands, laughing at my supposed inability to follow basic corporate reasoning. He walked them through the far northwestern suburbs commercial land deal, emphasizing that I was prepared to let him hold the asset inside an independent limited liability company with Hargrove Holdings standing as the full financial guarantor. Celeste shrieked with delight, her voice sharp and high through the speakers. She launched immediately into projections of how the eventual profits would pad their offshore accounts. But Loretta said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, deliberate, and saturated with a calculated, venomous hunger. She told Brennan to stop celebrating and start thinking like a true predator. She turned my offer over with the instincts of a seasoned grifter. She pointed out that if Hargrove Holdings was acting as the formal guarantor on a $15 million loan, the corporate board of directors would inevitably demand a thorough review of the transaction. They would require regular audits of the development project and would almost certainly claim a meaningful cut of the final profits in exchange for assuming the financial risk. Loretta argued that my apparent decline might be useful leverage, but the rest of the executive committee remained sharp and watchful. She told Brennan that pulling the board into this deal was a serious exposure. If any of the senior directors examined the independent company closely, they might surface the Lumenina Design Shell Corporation. They might uncover the embezzled funds. Loretta insisted they could not afford to put their entire shadow operation at risk just to secure corporate backing for one land acquisition. She declared that Hargrove Holdings needed to be cut out of the equation altogether. They needed outright control of the asset, every dollar of the eventual profits going directly to them, with no board, no auditors, and no oversight in the way. That cowardice of his rose to the surface for just a moment. Brennan wanted to know how they could possibly land a $15 million commercial real estate loan with no corporate giant like Hargrove Holdings standing behind the credit. Loretta's response was a sharp, scornful laugh that cut clean through the silence of my study. He was thinking like a small man, she told him. Had he forgotten everything they had already quietly stolen? Had he forgotten just how deep their pockets had grown through years of looting my company? And then she hit him with the real point. That palatial estate he called home, the ultra-luxury property I had bought outright for him, in cash a wedding gift, from a father who loved too blindly that mansion was about to become their lever. Loretta's strategy was as audacious as it was catastrophic. She told Brennan to take a high-interest mortgage against the unencumbered mansion without delay, and use that cash as the opening move. After that, she said, put Lumenina Design to work. Month after month, that shell operation had been quietly vacuuming hundreds of thousands in fraudulent consulting fees straight out of my company's accounts. On paper, it looked like a thriving cash-rich business. That fiction, she explained, was exactly what they needed. Lumenina Design would serve as the primary cross-guarantor on the remaining balance of the $15 million acquisition loan, marry the mansion's equity to the fabricated financial picture of the shell company, and they could close the deal without touching Hargrove Holdings at all. It was a plan that made my blood run cold, not with fear, but with recognition. They were stacking borrowed money on top of fraudulent paper and calling it a foundation. One crack in the far northwestern suburbs, development one, zoning reversal, one market correction, and the whole thing would collapse, burying them under a mountain of high-interest debt they could never escape. The mansion gone, the shell company torn open for the world to see, everything reduced to rubble, but arrogance is a powerful blindfold. All they could see was $15 million in real estate equity sitting just out of reach of my board of directors, theirs to pocket entirely. Celeste was already spending the money in her head, giddy with anticipation. Brennan, dependable, hollow, greedy. Brennan did what he always did. He swallowed his mother-in-law's poison and called it wisdom. He told Loretta she was a genius. He was certain they'd found the gap in my defenses, that this was the move that guaranteed their independence once and for all. I sat and let their laughter wash over me, and what I felt was something cold and deeply satisfying. I had placed a rope within their reach. Loretta had done the rest, braided it, looped it, and fitted it around all of their necks herself. Over the 48 hours that followed, Rook and Aldous kept watch over a cascade of desperate, reckless financial maneuvers. Brennan was in a hurry, consumed by the fear that whatever window of supposed weakness I'd opened might slam shut as my mind supposedly dimmed. He went to a predatory private lending firm, the sort of institution that prices its loans like extortion and keeps its intake questions to a minimum. He threw himself at a massive mortgage application, pulling every last dollar of equity from his luxurious home. While he handled that, Loretta was finalizing the paperwork to lock Luminina Design in as the corporate guarantor, packaging their fabricated financials as evidence of solvency. Speed was everything to them. They were so drunk on the smell of unearned millions that the punishing penalty clauses buried deep in the fine print never even registered. Friday morning, the trap had been wound tight and was ready to spring. Rook pulled the digital transmission of the final purchase contracts directly from the private lender's pipeline. I was at my heavy walnut desk watching the live feed as Brennan and Loretta accessed the secure portal to sign. They were in Brennan's home office, expensive coffee steaming beside them. Zero awareness that every keystroke they made was being captured in real time. I watched the cursor glide. Brennan's digital signature landed on the primary loan agreement, lashing his personal estate to that enormous commercial obligation. Then, Loretta signed as the registered agent of Luminina Design, and just like that, the shell company was formally bound to the cross guarantee. The digital stamps clicked into place. Irrevocable, absolute, legally airtight. They had taken a $15 million anvil and strapped it to their own wrists, and they had done it with a smile. I leaned back in my chair, let the cold satisfaction spread across my face like frost. Flawless. They had gone out of their way to cut Hargrove Holdings loose from the deal, and in doing so, they had bet everything they'd stolen, every luxury, every hidden asset, every shred of their personal security, on nothing but greed. They believed they had secured their empire. They believed the board meeting would be a formality barely worth attending the moment they'd finally lock away the senile old man and walk away with everything. What they could not see was that the earth they stood on had already been hollowed out beneath their feet. I called Aldous, told him the signatures were in place, told him to have the final phase ready to execute by Monday morning. Years of patience had led to this. It was time to throw the switch. Monday came in cold and sharp, the kind of bitter early chill that matched the mood inside my study exactly. I'd told Aldous to be at my home before the city had any light in it. This conversation required walls around it, no corporate hallways, no chance of Brennan's eyes landing on us. Aldous walked through my door at exactly 5:00, his heavy leather briefcase in hand. He wore exhaustion on his face, but behind his eyes there was something else, the hard gleam of a man who had just watched a long plan land perfectly. He took the leather armchair across from my desk, accepted the black coffee I slid toward him. He didn't say anything at first. He reached into the briefcase, pulled out a thick official dossier bound in stark red government folders, and set it on the table with quiet deliberateness. "It is done," Aldous said. His voice was low, unhurried, settled. The county registrar processed the deeds at midnight. Brennan and Loretta are now the sole undisputed legal owners of the far northwestern suburbs commercial parcel. I took a slow pull of my coffee. The liquid was scalding, but I barely felt it. and the financial structure executed precisely as they designed it, driven by nothing but their own unmitigated greed. Aldous confirmed. Brennan holds the primary deed through his newly formed LLC. The whole purchase was financed by the high-interest private mortgage he pulled against his residential estate. Lumenina Design. Loretta's fraudulent shell corporation is on record as the primary cross-guarantor. Hargrove Holdings has been cleanly and completely cut out of the transaction. They tore out our corporate guarantee clauses themselves, racing to make sure every dollar of profit stayed off our books and in their hands. I nodded and let that cold, grim satisfaction deepen. The environmental reports, Aldous, show me. Aldous opened the red folder and pushed a heavily classified, extensively redacted federal document across the table toward me. An Environmental Protection Agency geological survey. To someone who didn't know what they were looking at, or to an arrogant amateur like my son, that $15 million parcel in the far northwestern suburbs appeared to be a gift from the universe. Prime position near major transit corridors. Wealthy residential neighborhoods pressing in from all sides. Every surface indicator pointed to a luxury retail and residential development waiting to happen. But Brennan had been so thoroughly mesmerized by the prize I'd dangled that he'd never slowed down long enough to order his own soil analysis. He took the portfolio I put together at face value, an outdated, deliberately thin survey that said nothing about what lay beneath that ground. This property, Aldous said, pressing a fingertip to a specific paragraph in the federal document, operated as an unregulated chemical manufacturing plant throughout the 1950s. Before anyone was watching, before any oversight existed, they pushed thousands of gallons of heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, and highly corrosive industrial solvents straight into the earth. The factory was torn down and paved over decades ago, and the contamination has been sitting there quietly ever since. I read the chemical breakdown on the page and moved my eyes to its federal classification status. 3 weeks ago, it was quietly designated a federal Superfund site, Aldous said. A tight, merciless smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. The federal government has issued an immediate mandatory catastrophic environmental remediation order. The toxic plume is already moving toward the local water table. That land cannot be built on. It is poisoned ground. It is worth nothing. That hummed the particular frequency of a perfectly sprung trap moved through my chest. A federal Superfund designation is the worst news that can ever reach a commercial real estate holder. It is a pit with no bottom. Under federal law, whoever's name sits on the deed at the time of designation carries the full weight of the government-ordered cleanup, no exceptions, no matter who actually put the poison in the ground. What does the preliminary remediation bill look like? I asked. I already had the number. I wanted to hear it said out loud in that quiet room. $15 million, and Aldous answered without a flicker of hesitation. That covers the initial excavation and contaminated soil processing only. Federal fines, legal penalties, and the secondary water table decontamination work are all additional. And the liability cannot be walked away from through standard bankruptcy. It is federally mandated and follows the deed. I drew the red folder closed and passed my palm slowly across its surface. Brennan believed he had taken a $15 million asset. What he had actually done was volunteer himself for a $15 million federal liability. He'd taken a fully paid-off mansion and mortgaged it to the hilt to acquire a plot of poisoned earth. And by running Lumenina Design as the cross-guarantor, he'd legally welded his fraudulent shell company to that enormous federal obligation. They wanted every last dollar of the profit. I said quietly, the irony sitting on my tongue like something sweet and sharp at once. Not 1 cent was going to be shared with the Hargrove Holdings Board of Directors, so they worked the paperwork, carved their own companies out of the deal, and shut us out entirely. In their scramble to steal from me, they erected a solid legal wall that sealed my empire safely away from the wreckage. They had swallowed every ounce of the risk themselves. Precisely, Aldous confirmed. Ahiju required Hargrove Holdings to guarantee that loan. The company would now be staring down a $15 million cleanup bill. We would be in the middle of an unmitigated catastrophe. But by playing the fading senile old man, you made Brennan believe he had to shield the asset from your supposed incompetence. Loretta's greed took care of the rest. She pushed him into putting their stolen money behind the property. They assembled their own financial prison, walked inside it willingly, and left you holding the only key. The poetic perfection of it was staggering. Brennan had been so certain my mind was crumbling. Every misplaced file, every calculated stumble, he read all of it as evidence of advancing Alzheimer's. The idea that a man who had spent 40 years threading through the most dangerous corridors of corporate life might be laying a deliberate trap never crossed his mind. He had looked at that property portfolio and seen a fast lane to wealth beyond counting. He never recognized that the fast lane ended at the edge of a cliff. When the private lenders discovered that the collateral they accepted sits on a federal Superfund site, what happens then? I asked. I was watching the window as the first gray-purple light of dawn began to seep into the sky. They called the loan immediately. Aldous laid it out in a tone completely drained of sympathy. They will move to seize Brennan's residential estate before the month is out. His personal accounts will be aggressively liquidated to cover the gap. After that, the federal government will go after Luminina Design for the outstanding environmental remediation costs. When federal auditors crack open Luminina Design's books to go after its assets, they will find the embezzled funds sitting right there. The agents will pull the fabricated invoices. They will trace the offshore wire transfers back to Loretta and Celeste. Every thread will unravel in open court. I'll let him dig his own grave, I said, and left it at that. The morning of the annual board meeting arrived under a low, heavy sky, the kind that flattens the light and presses gray through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hargrove Holdings executive boardroom. I was there 45 minutes ahead of anyone else, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that felt slightly too large, a small but deliberate detail. One more brushstroke on the portrait of decline I had been patiently painting all week. I dropped into my usual seat at the head of the long, polished oak table, rolled my shoulders forward, and let my gaze wander loosely toward the far end of the room, as though nothing quite held my attention anymore. The senior directors began arriving just after 9 in the morning. These were people I had stood beside for decades, ruthless financial operators, razor-sharp legal minds, aggressive real estate developers who had been there when this empire was still an idea. I had forged something extraordinary alongside them. As they moved to their seats, I felt their eyes finding me in quick, careful glances, some carrying a quiet pity, others a cool, calculating appraisal. The story Brennan had been seeding so methodically had clearly taken root. Brennan himself came through the door, right on schedule, his personal legal team flanking him, wearing the manner of the conquering heir apparent. The charcoal gray suit was immaculate, the expression on his face a calibrated portrait of solemn duty. He made a point of pausing beside my chair, dropping a firm, condescending hand onto my shoulder. In a voice pitched just high enough for the nearest directors to catch, he asked whether I was feeling equal to the demands of today's proceedings. I didn't look up. I gave a slow nod, hands resting quietly on the table, concealing how utterly still and steady they were. Brennan crossed to the far end of the table, the executive vice president's position, and settled in. A heavy, waiting silence filled the room. The opening agenda items were dispatched with brisk, almost impatient efficiency. Quarterly financials approved, legal disclosures acknowledged, routine operational updates logged and set aside. Everyone present understood that none of that was why they had actually come. The air carried the unmistakable charge of something larger, the feeling of a room bracing for an execution. I sat through the ordinary business, quietly offering the occasional muddled question, stumbling slightly over a term I'd used 1,000 times before the last few strokes, completing the illusion I had constructed so carefully. At precisely 10:30, the slot reserved for new executive business, Brennan rose from his chair. Every conversation in the room stopped. He didn't launch straight into it. He drew a slow, measured breath, inhabiting the posture of a man shouldering a painful but unavoidable responsibility. He dropped his gaze to the polished wood, letting the silence stretch. When he finally raised his eyes, they carried a gloss of carefully manufactured emotion. He had evidently rehearsed that particular look at length, probably in the mirror of the mansion I had bought for him. He opened by honoring the legacy of Hargrove Holdings. He spoke at length about my decades of relentless drive, my strategic instincts, the sacrifices behind the company I had built into an $800 million institution. His delivery was smooth, measured, and coated in a reverence so thick it bordered on suffocating. He told the board I was not merely a chief executive to him, but a personal hero, a mentor, and a devoted father. The picture he painted of our bond was so dense with manufactured sentiment that something close to nausea moved through me. Then his register shifted. the warmth drained out, replaced by a trembling, weighted sorrow. He told the room that sometimes the most loving thing a son could do was acknowledge when his hero was no longer able to carry the fight alone. He reported that over the past 6 months, he and the family had watched a severe and heartbreaking erosion of my cognitive abilities. He walked the board through my engineered memory lapses, my staged confusion over routine financial documents, my pretended inability to follow basic corporate strategy. He swept the room with a mournful look, locking eyes with the most powerful directors, assuring them he had done everything possible to shield my condition from view and preserve my dignity. Brennan reached into his tailored leather briefcase and pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope. He broke the seal with a sharp, deliberate tear, the sound of it carrying in the silence of the boardroom. The documents came out and settled on the table in front of him. It was the fraudulent medical dossier put together by Loretta's compromised associate, Dr. Wyndham. Brennan announced that he had persuaded me to undergo a thorough, independent neurological evaluation. His voice fractured on cue with a precisely timed catch in his throat as he told the room that the findings had been devastating. He directed his legal counsel to distribute certified copies of the medical file to every director at the table. I sat still and watched the thick packets of forged documentation move hand to hand down the line. Directors opened the files and scanned the dense clinical language, the fabricated imaging analyses, the definitive fraudulent diagnosis of rapidly progressing early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Pages turned in quiet rustles, and a low current of concerned murmuring began to move through the room. Brennan allowed that weight to sit on them for several minutes before he continued. He pressed a single manufactured tear from his cheek, squared up his shoulders, and declared that the medical record was beyond dispute. My decline had moved past any point of workable recovery. He made the argument with forceful practice logic that Hargrove Holdings could not afford to operate under a compromised hand. He insisted the current market demanded decisive, clear-eyed leadership, precisely what the report confirmed I could no longer supply. He played the role of the reluctant corporate guardian, without a crack, insisting the last thing he wanted was power for himself, that his only concern was protecting the legacy his father had built. He brought the board's attention to an obscure provision buried in the depths of our corporate bylaws, the medical incapacity proxy clause. He explained that the founding documents were unambiguous in the event of severe medically verified cognitive decline. The board carried a fiduciary obligation to execute an immediate involuntary transfer of executive authority to the sitting vice president. His eyes found mine directly then. Whatever sorrow his voice was performing, his gaze was empty of it entirely. He told the board it was time to let the old lion rest. With one final heavy sigh, Brennan formally entered the forged medical dossier into the official corporate record. Then, he made his last lethal move. Wearing the mask of a devoted son, doing what love demanded, he formally called for an immediate binding vote, asking the board of directors to enact the proxy strip me of every shred of corporate authority and hand absolute uncontested executive control of Hargrove Holdings directly to him. The trap had fully closed, and every person in that room was about to watch it. The silence that followed his dramatic appeal settled over the boardroom like a low ceiling. Directors shifted their eyes toward me, a mixture of hesitation and quiet sympathy written on their faces. They were braced for the reaction of a man whose grip on reality was loosening a confused outburst, some flicker of lost composure. Brennan remained on his feet at the far end of the glass table, holding his posture of a grieving son carrying out an agonizing obligation. His eyes found mine, a silent dare buried underneath the performance of sorrow. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hands on the table. What I did instead was ease back slowly into my leather chair and let out a quiet, relaxed chuckle. It moved through the room like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward in waves of confusion. The chuckle settled into a genuine, unhurried smile. I reached beneath the edge of the desk and pressed a small silver button. The double doors at the rear of the boardroom swung open with a sharp, resonant thud. Every head at that table whipped around. Brennan's composure cracked his carefully built mask, slipping for just a moment as his eyes jumped to the entrance. Aldous walked through the doors, his pace unhurried, his bearing, projecting the calm of a man who holds every card. He was not alone. On either side of him walked two men whose presence did not read as a corporate dispute. It read as a criminal investigation. Tall, dark-suited badges from the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation displayed without apology. And behind them, moving unsteadily, looking as though his legs might give out, came a man none of the board members had ever seen in person, though his name was on every document sitting in front of them. Dr. Wyndham, the corrupt neurologist Loretta had paid to construct my fraudulent decline. He was a wretched sight. Pale face shining with sweat, a leather portfolio clutched against his chest, like armor eyes skittering across the room, before dropping to the floor and staying there. A wave of startled murmuring broke out among the directors. The chairman rose to his feet, demanding an explanation for the intrusion. I lifted one hand. The room went quiet. The authority in that single gesture, the kind that had been absent from me for weeks, made several directors visibly blink. I addressed the board with perfect composure, thanking Brennan for his moving, if entirely invented performance. I watched the color drain from my son's face in real time. The flush of impending victory vanished, and what replaced it was a cold, creeping dread, spreading from his jaw downward. I gestured toward the trembling doctor hovering near the doorway. I told the board that before a single vote was cast on the matter of my capacity, they deserved to hear from the man whose name was on the diagnosis. Aldous stepped forward and made the formal introductions. The federal agents and Dr. Wyndham then explained that the doctor was present under the terms of a federal plea agreement. Investigators had intercepted communications that established beyond any reasonable doubt that the medical dossier on the table was a fabrication from start to finish. Wyndham had accepted a substantial bribe from Luminina Design to falsify those records, a serious felony that put both his medical license and his freedom in jeopardy. To avoid the maximum sentence, he had agreed to wear a recording device during his final meeting with Loretta and to provide complete testimony about the conspiracy in its entirety. The boardroom fractured into stunned chaos. Directors tore through the fraudulent medical files with new eyes. Brennan stood frozen at his end of the table, his mouth working silently, no words coming out. The portrait he had painted of himself, the devoted, burdened son, disintegrated in an instant, exposing the frightened, cornered thief underneath. One of the federal agents stepped forward. His voice was flat, professional, the kind that cuts through noise without raising its volume. He addressed the board, directly telling them that the FBI had been tracking an extensive money laundering and corporate embezzlement operation running out of my son's office. Millions of dollars had been bled from Hargrove Holdings through fictitious consulting fees and routed into offshore accounts under Brennan's and his mother-in-law's control. The agent's gaze moved to Brennan, whose knuckles had gone white against the table's edge. He announced that the Financial Crimes Division had just executed a coordinated raid on Luminina Design's offices and on Brennan's residential estate. He then walked the horrified board through the financial trap Brennan had blindly stumbled into 3 days earlier, how the vice president had used embezzled funds and his own mansion as collateral to secure a $15 million commercial loan for a property he was certain would make him untouchable. Aldous stepped in to deliver the killing blow with the precision of a surgeon. He brought up the federal environmental reports on the large monitor at the front of the room. He explained to the stunned executives that the property Brennan had purchased was a federally designated toxic waste site, Superfund status, severe chemical contamination, and an inescapable legal liability that attached itself permanently to whoever held the deed. And because Brennan had acted in secret hiding, everything behind his personal corporation, and using Luminina Design as the cross-guarantor, Hargrove Holdings had been completely insulated from the federal cleanup debt. I sat in my chair and watched my son absorb the full dimensions of his ruin. His knees buckled, and he sank back into his seat, eyes wide, face hollowed out by a disbelieving panic. The realization arrived in that moment with crushing completeness. Every move he had made over the past month had been seen, anticipated, and guided by the very man he believed he was dismantling. The senile old fool he had ridiculed behind closed doors had walked him into a toxic, inescapable financial pit, and at the same time delivered him straight into federal hands. The second agent moved with deliberate slowness down the full length of the glass table. The silence that had returned was broken only by the measured, unhurried sound of his footsteps on the floor. He came to a stop directly behind Brennan's chair. He asked my son in a calm and even voice to rise and place his hands behind his back. The metallic snap of the handcuffs rang through the executive boardroom like a shot. The board sat in paralyzed, disbelieving silence as the vice president of Hargrove Holdings was placed under formal arrest, corporate espionage, felony embezzlement, federal wire fraud. I rose from my chair, and I felt something release a weight that had been pressing down on me for longer than I could name. The suit no longer felt oversized. My spine was straight, my mind running clean and fast, sharper than it had been in years. I looked at my son as the agents moved him from the table, tears cutting down his face, small and pathetic. There was no softness in me, only the cold, settled finality of a fight completely won. I turned back to face the board, every eye fixed on me, straightened my tie with one deliberate motion, placed both hands flat on the polished wood, and informed them that the executive vice president had been relieved of his position. It was time to return to the business of running this company. The wide oak doors stood open behind me, and out in the corridor the rest of the executive staff had gathered, frozen in silence. I turned my eyes back to Brennan once more. He was still in his chair, trembling, the agent stationed at his shoulders. I drew a slow breath and let the full authority I had never actually surrendered expand through the room. The voice that had spent weeks performing confusion and frailty now filled the space with the weight of a man who had built something from the ground up and never let go of it for a single day. I told him that the medical report was a pitiful forgery, a desperate fiction dreamed up by a man without the backbone or the talent to create anything of his own. But the $15 million in sec federal debt he had put his name to the day before, that was completely real. I watched the understanding move across his face like a tide pulling back to expose the bare rock beneath. He had leveraged everything, his home, his hidden wealth, his future, for a piece of poisoned ground. The boardroom held its breath. The only sound was the quick echoing strike of footsteps coming up the marble corridor outside. Then the doors were shoved open hard. Loretta and Celeste came rushing in, their faces bright with arrogant expectation. Celeste was carrying a chilled bottle of imported champagne. Loretta had a set of crystal flutes in her hands. They had been staged in the executive lobby, waiting for Brennan's signal that the vote had gone through and I had been stripped of everything. They had come to stand over the grave of my career and open something expensive. They stopped cold the instant they crossed the threshold. The champagne bottle slid from Celeste's manicured grip and hit the polished hardwood with a crash. The expensive liquid pooled around her designer shoes, as fitting a metaphor for their collapsing dreams as anything I could have scripted. They stood in open horror at the federal agent's position behind Brennan and at Dr. Wyndham, who had retreated to the corner and was weeping quietly. Loretta's eyes swept the room in rapid, desperate arcs, hunting for some exit from a situation that had no exit. The board members stared back at her with unconcealed disgust. She looked to Brennan for the arrogant puppet she had controlled for years and found only a shattered, sobbing child. Then her eyes landed on mine. I gave her nothing. I reached into my leather briefcase and drew out a thick stack of financial documents. I brought them down onto the glass table with both hands, the impact cracking through the silence like a gunshot. I told Loretta those folders held every fabricated invoice, every concealed offshore wire transfer, and every piece of damning evidence tied to Luminina Design. I informed the room that for the past year, these two women had been active participants in a scheme to embezzle $800,000 from Hargrove Holdings. Celeste let out a sharp, piercing gasp and raised both hands to her face. Loretta stepped back, shaking her head in rapid denial, insisting it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that Brennan had pulled them into it against their will. I didn't dignify her lies with a response. I turned to Brennan and delivered the final blow. I told him the predatory private bank had already been alerted to the fraudulent cross guarantees used to secure the commercial land loan. Because they had deliberately misrepresented Luminina Design's financial standing, the bank had triggered an immediate default clause. His luxurious mansion, I informed him with cold precision, had been officially foreclosed upon that very morning. They had no home. Beyond that, the federal government was already moving to seize whatever assets remained to fund the $15 million environmental remediation penalty on the toxic site. They had taken on absolute personal liability, and now it was crushing them. The full magnitude of their destruction arrived all at once like a building coming down. Brennan slid from his leather chair and dropped heavily to his knees on the boardroom floor. The conquering heir apparent, the man who had mapped out my confinement in a secure psychiatric facility with such cool confidence, was now on the floor reaching toward my shoes. His hands were shaking, his words barely coherent through his sobs. He begged me to reverse the transactions to use the resources of Hargrove Holdings, to absorb the federal fines to save his home, to save his wife. He cried out that I was his father, that blood demanded I protect him. I looked down at him with a detachment so complete, it was almost clinical, as though I were watching someone I had never met before. I told him he had surrendered the right to claim that bond the moment he set out to erase me. Loretta broke into raw, unfiltered screaming. She shrieked that she was a respected woman, that prison was unthinkable, that her reputation would not survive it. One of the federal agents stepped forward without urgency and produced a second arrest warrant with her name on it. He informed her that the FBI had no interest in her standing in society, only in the $800,000 she had helped steal from my corporation. Celeste buckled against the wall and slid slowly to the floor as the reality settled over her that the life she had built on stolen luxury was permanently finished. Nothing remained for her but the memory of wealth she had never earned and would never see again. The boardroom held its silence, every director watching the full unraveling of the conspiracy play out in front of them. I stepped back from Brennan, making sure my shoes stayed clean. I looked at the three of them, a tangled, collapsed wreckage of broken ambition and fully exposed malice. My thoughts drifted, as they sometimes do in moments like that, back to my 70th birthday dinner, the precise night all of this had truly begun. I remembered sitting at the head of my table, surrounded by people I had spent a lifetime supporting, feeling something cold and invisible forming between us. I could still see the dismissive, knowing glances they had passed between themselves when they believed my attention was elsewhere. I remembered how quickly they had moved through the evening, eager to get back to their scheming, treating my milestone as little more than an inconvenient obligation to discharge. I brought my focus back to Brennan, still weeping against the hardwood floor. My voice was quiet, but it reached every corner of that room without effort, steady, unhurried, and sharp as a blade. I told him that, on the night of my birthday, they had all been far too preoccupied to sit at a table and share a meal with me. I reminded him of the rushing, the manufactured excuses, the contempt that passed for celebration. I let a pause sit between us, deliberate, waited, and then I told him he would never again need to worry about rushing through a dinner. I promised him that he and Loretta would now have years of uninterrupted time in a federal prison cell, with nothing but cafeteria food and each other for company. I gave a single nod toward the agents. They moved immediately and in concert. The hard click of handcuffs closing rang through the room, and with that sound, their ruin was made permanent and absolute. Celeste watched in mute terror as the agents walked her weeping husband and her screaming mother out through the boardroom doors. She had managed, whether by design or fortune, to keep her signature off the purchase documents and the fraudulent shell accounts which spared her from immediate federal indictment. But that legal distance offered her no real shelter from what her life had become. The bank had taken the estate at dawn. Federal authorities had already frozen the shared accounts as preliminary collateral against the $15 million toxic cleanup liability. She had nothing. I stood near the head of the glass table and watched my private security team guide her out of the building with quiet firmness. She walked out with nothing beyond the designer clothes on her back. The room emptied gradually until only Aldous and I remained. I crossed to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city spread below. I watched the federal cruisers light up and pull from the curb, carrying what was left of my treacherous family toward the end of everything they had tried to build. A deep quiet settled over the room, a stillness I had not felt in well over a year. I turned from the window and looked at Aldous, who was working through the last of the legal files with efficient, practiced hands. I told him to draw up the paperwork to permanently and irrevocably disinherit Brennan from my estate. I directed him to restructure my personal will and the foundational corporate bylaws of Hargrove Holdings from the ground up. My shares were to be reallocated to the loyal, long-tenured employees who had actually poured themselves into building this company beside me. On top of that, I instructed Aldous to establish a substantial, independently managed scholarship foundation, one dedicated to funding hungry young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds who carry genuine drive, not inherited expectation. Aldous nodded with measured professional respect and confirmed the new directives would be fully executed before the week was out. I returned to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged exceptional scotch. I poured 2 fingers of neat scotch into a thick glass and watched the amber catch the pale light filtering through the overcast sky. I took a slow, unhurried sip and let the warmth move through me. I was a 70-year-old man, alone standing in the middle of a corporate empire I had built with my own hands. I had just watched my only son consumed entirely by a disease called greed. Another man might have buckled under that weight. Another man might have grieved the illusion of a family he never actually had. But standing there with the city skyline stretching out before me, the same skyline I had conquered across 4 decades, I felt no sorrow. Not a trace of parental regret, not a shadow of grief. I had located a spreading malignancy and removed it cleanly before it could devour what I had spent a lifetime building. I had defended the empire, and I had reclaimed complete sovereignty over my own life. The air in that room felt different, lighter, cleaner, easy to breathe for the first time in a long while. I took another slow sip of the scotch, letting the taste of it linger. My legacy was secure, insulated from the hands that had tried so hard to bleed it dry. The financial district would be loud with whispers in the days ahead, but those whispers had lost all power over me. And that is where the story ends, not with a celebration, but with a long, quiet breath in an empty boardroom and the weight of something finally finished. I have thought about this a great deal since. What this cost was not just a year of careful, exhausting performance. It cost me the version of my son I had always hoped he would become. There is a particular grief in that one that does not go away cleanly, no matter how justified the outcome. I believe God does not promise us that doing right will feel painless. But I do believe His timing is never wasted, and that what was built in honesty cannot be permanently taken by those who only know how to take. If this family revenge story taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First, never let a man's eagerness to receive a gift blind you to what the gift reveals about his character. Brennan's greed was not hidden. I simply had to stop making excuses for it. Second, the person working hardest to appear loyal is often the one you should be watching most closely. Performance and integrity are not the same thing. Third, when someone tries to use your perceived weakness against you, your greatest power is letting them believe they are succeeding. Patience is not passivity, it is precision. For those of you in the adults at 50+ season of life who have ever been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly maneuvered out of something you built, this story is for you. A family revenge story like this one is extreme, but the truth underneath it is not. Your experience is not a liability. It is your edge. If this moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so we can keep telling the stories that matter. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.